Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to introduce Kathy Smith, um, who is a tribal member with the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community and is the, I want to get this right, and is she who takes care of the wild rice for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And she's going to give an overview of the commission's work and in particular talk about the cultural significance and ecology of wild rice. And hopefully we'll get some information about a rice camp that is going to be open to the public. Fingers crossed. If you all wouldn't mind making sure that your audio is turned off so that we don't get any interruptions, we should be ready to start. Kathy, take it away.
Miigwech for having me. Bujun in way magadug, wasan no de que in jinikaz, Mayingen in do dam, Nishanabe que in da, Wakwe dung in Dunjuba. So my name is Kathleen Smith. I'm with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and today I'm going to bring a presentation for ceded territory Manoomin stewardship. So our relationship, with Manoomin has been long ongoing as Anishinaabe people. And so my position is ganawendang Manoomin, which is an Ojibwe Mowin, which means she who takes care of the wild rice. So my position that I hold, I've held it since September, actually integrates traditional knowledge. Roger Levine is on here, who was one of my mentors to really show me how to have this relationship with Manoomin. And so with many knowledge holders that I do have, I have been able to speak on behalf of this great gift that Yajay Manadu has given us.
Well, I know you sent me that message, but I mean that you were back, but I just sent a clarification, like you want me to bring that stuff down here or?
That's what I said.
Yeah, I know. You said bring it here.
You want to argue about it?
So, yeah, I'll argue about it.
We're hearing a lot of activity and argument between a couple. If you could mute your audio, that'd be awesome.
So who is GLIFWC? GLIFWC was formed in 1984 and represents 11 Ojibwe tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So those member tribes were able to reserve their right to hunting and fishing and gathering rights in the 1836, 37, 42, and 1854 treaties with the United States governments. So what we do is we actually provide natural resource management expertise, conservation enforcement, legal and policy analysis, and public information services in support of the exercise of treaty rights during well-regulated off-reservation seasons throughout the ceded territory. So what GLIFWC really oversees is off-reservation. So each tribe has their own governing system. So for example, KBIC, since they're in your area where I'm from, they actually have their own policy. Same with LBD, where Roger's from, and Waters Meet. So this is the ceded territories of each of the treaty areas for each member tribe. So we got Mille Lacs over in Minnesota with Fond du Lac. We have St. Croix, Lac-Courte, Bad River, where I'm located, Lac du Flambeau, and Mole Lake in Wisconsin. So we also have LVD and Keweenaw Bay Indian Community. And then we have Bay Mills all the way up towards the Sioux. So who are we governed by? We're actually governed by the Board of Commissioners, which is composed of a tribal chairperson or a representative from each tribe. We also have a Voight Intertribal Task Force, which is composed of 10 members plus the chairperson. So we actually address the matters that only affect in 1837 and 1842 ceded territories. And we also have a Great Lakes Fisheries Committee because a lot of our sustenance is from, the fisheries. So our treaty rights are GLIFWC's member tribes sign treaties in the 36, 37, 42, and 54 with the United States government. And those treaties, they are ceded, which is sold land in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. But we also retained our rights to hunt, fish, and gather in those areas. So they were actually ignored when the states assumed statehood and began regulating their own natural resources. And they became reaffirmed in the mid-1900s. The tribes sought legal affirmation of the treaty rights. So there was actually several positive court decisions that ensued in the Northwest and Great Lakes region that affirmed treaty rights and ruled for self-regulation. So that's where I was talking about. Each tribe has their own self-regulation. So with the GLIFWC Manoomin Stewardship Program, we do abundance monitoring by ground surveys and aerial photos, which is we're all a grant-derived program here. So we actually have to go out and write grants, and then we get monies to sustain, this work that we do for Manoomin on behalf of the tribes. So we also gain long-term trend information by doing those surveys. We have so much information about the aerial photos, which I'll get into a little bit more later. So we have management evaluation, problem identification service to harvesters, and information is posted onto our website. So for these harvesters, they're actually in the state of Wisconsin, because the state of Wisconsin actually has a permit system to where we can actually track tribal and non-tribal harvesters. So why do we have that? And it's because of the affirmation of off-reservation treaty rights. Wisconsin has approximately 5,000 acres of wild rice waters within ceded territory. In Michigan, at this time, it has kind of an unknown amount of rice waters because we don't really have a way of being able to keep track of that. So it depends on per tribe. So Roger for LVD, he knows how many acres that he has, and KB, it kind of goes back and forth. So I could speak a little bit about that. So they have, a few lakes that they keep the Manoomin stewardship for. So looking ahead for my presentation, we're going to look at Manoomin ecology, the cultural significance, processing, climate change threats, and stewardship. So this picture is actually courtesy of Jerry Jondrew, who is a KBIC member, and he actually goes into Minnesota and harvests wild rice, and that's his way of being able to sustain his way of life through having rice for his family and also for selling. So what is Manoomin? Wild rice. So it's Zizinia palustris. It's a northern species, and it's also an annual aquatic plant. So it's actually a grass. So there is a southern species, which is Zizinia aquatica. It's a taller species, and I'm getting to know a little bit more about it, but it actually has a smaller rice kernel than it does, the northern species. And since the plants are much taller, they are known to use hooks to harvest, and they actually live mostly in the riverine system. So like in the Mississippi basin down south, that's where we kind of know it a little bit more, to where our Ho-Chunk relatives, I know of one person that does actually go out and harvest rice, but it's a little bit more difficult to get to. So wild rice today. So I was actually able to punch in Google today and see what is wild rice. And as you can see, we just had a Eagle announcement for $100,000 grant support. So, wild rice is becoming, pretty a popular subject, within Indigenous communities and also all communities of all sorts. And as you can see, UP Matters has learned about wild rice with ganawendang, Manoomin, which is number 2, and it probably goes from my search engine. So I was able to kind of download this and kind of see what the conversations were about wild rice. And there's all sorts of information to where, it can plant the seeds in everybody to go and seek out what you want to learn about wild rice, and plus with my presentation. So where does wild rice grow? Throughout the whole United States. And this is why we must stewardship this precious gift. So from our area, it actually comes from around us here throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. We do have, you know, some areas where there's a rare species down in Texas, and then also California and Oregon are pretty good growers, you know, for the cultivated. So ideal growing habitat, you know, Manoomin really loves its feet wet. It grows best in soft organic muck substrate. So what Roger would tell me to do is actually go out and walk into it. He said, you got to really feel the muck. You can feel it squish between your toes, he said. But he goes, don't be shy. Just go out there and go walk it, because you want to have that good muck to be able to have the best habitat. So it's best in water, which is grown into a 1/2 foot to 3 foot deep. It's also wind pollinated. Bees are considered pollen nappers. When I heard this, I was kind of crushed a little bit. So instead of, you know, going from, you know, flower to flower, it actually takes the pollen and it doesn't go and visit, you know, the female flowers, which I was really devastated. So we also have to have meandering rivers and then lakes that have an inlet and an outlet with a gentle flow. And the kernels are actually in different size between rivers and lakes, but it depends on the region that you're from. So I know from Wisconsin, Mole Lake and Aliquosh Lake in Wisconsin, they actually have, you know, bigger kernels because they're from lakes. And then where river rice is actually a little bit smaller kernel, but it all varies. But when you look at, you know, good processed rice, you know, sometimes it can almost look the same, because what we do is we kind of process it out. So sometimes it can actually grow to a swift of current, and it may not produce seed if it's too swift. But sometimes, you know, the swiftness can help, you know, carry the seed a little bit, you know, through the ripening process, but it doesn't go very far. So the life cycle of wild rice. As you can see here, I have, you know, drawn this little picture about right around the spike of the wild rice seed. So wild rice actually ripens at different rates. So when you go through a rice bed, you can notice that some kind of fall, but then some are still not as ripe. That's because you can be able to go back and use that rice bed again and harvest some more. So also with the awning, it actually has a large barbed spike that can fend off seed-eating animals and can assist in seed dispersal. And also can help plant the seed. So what it does, it drops down into the muck substrate and it kind of augers in. So if you actually look at the awning through a microscope, oh my goodness, it has actual little spikes. So when you go out ricing and it gets into your clothing, you try not to wear good clothing because it will actually stick to your fleece sweatshirts and things like that. And it's really hard to get out of your clothing after a while. So that drops into the muck, and then it starts the germination process. As you can see, then it becomes submerged, and then it goes into the floating leaf stage. So the reason why I have that circled is because that's when it's most vulnerable. Usually you want to try to stay out of the rice beds, you know, especially when you're out there doing recreation, or if you want to float your canoe around them, because you can easily disturb the rice, especially when, you know, we have high rain events that can really be detrimental to your rice. You can tear it up. And I'll have some more pictures later on to kind of talk a little bit more about that. So then you can see that it has the seed head, and then it's got the male flowers on the bottom. So that's what I was talking about. You know, it's wind pollinated. We have different tillers, and then I've seen plants all the way up to about 6 tillers, and sometimes they will form, you know, other seed heads. So then you have the water level, and then you have the sediment, the roots it actually goes into. Then you have the prop roots, which actually look like the roots off of corn. So it's a pretty complicated plant. And it varies by season. So germination takes place in probably the spring and April. So by mid-May, submerged plants will actually get to be about 6 to 12 inches long. And then June is the floating leaf stage, as you can see right in here. And it's just, you know, just getting ready to stand up. So this is when it's most vulnerable. So by the end of June, then they're on top of the water surface, and then they reach from anywhere from 2 to 6 feet tall. And in the fall, you can see actually where there was a lot of herbivory. So we'll get a little bit more into that. So from year to year, it actually varies. So sometimes good, sometimes bad. Tribal elders actually tell us that there's a 4-year rule, but the climate change that we are looking at, studies and research are looking at the trends. They could be actually getting a little bit longer. So you can see where, you know, you have a good year, a not so good year, and then kind of a mediocre year. So the ecological benefits, it benefits water quality through its ability to bind the loose soils and tie up the nutrients. It acts as a buffer by slowing the winds by reducing waves across the shallow wetlands. Wild rice also helps reduce algal blooms, which are becoming increasing more and more so, and it improves water clarity. So we also have this reciprocal relationship with our animal nation. You may not know that, but wild rice is actually critical to the Sora rail. It may make up 94% of the Sora rail's diet in the fall. Rice beds provide stopover habitat for ducks and other migrating waterfowl. Rice beds provide nursery areas for small fish, frogs, and other aquatic relatives, so the common loon and the great blue heron and other aquatic eating bird species. And it's just great habitat, you know. So the presence of muskrats actually forage on the green shoots of the rice in the spring. So it's during that vulnerable stage. But sometimes when we say what happens to the muskrat, you know, will also happen to our rice. So these are some of the stories that we actually have. So they actually use wild rice for nesting materials. They also enhance the use of rice beds by creating little pathways for other animals in the dense cover, especially the migrating waterfowl. So it actually gives them a place to kind of hide and to be able to, you know, sustain their way of life. So protecting these areas are very important where wild rice thrives. And it's so important, and it will help ensure that all of the wildlife will benefit. So that's part of our reciprocal relationship by sharing our Manoomin with our animal nation. So what's the connection? What's our connection as Ojibwe people, as Anishinaabe people to the rice? So with the significance of Manoomin, in Ojibwe Mowin, it's translated as the good berry, and it is also known as a medicine, because we always talk about the Mishkiki, that food is medicine. The cultural significance to the member tribes, it's a part of our migration story. So it's important to have these stories, you know, that are told, you know, and we usually have them, you know, there's many stories of creation, you know, from all walks of life. And so this is our part, you know, for Ojibwe people. So it's also one of our 4 main feast foods that are used in ceremonies in our community feast today. So as Anishinaabe, we utilize this grain for sustenance, and it feeds our non-human human relatives as well. So the cultural significance to Anishinaabe, so we actually have a migration story, which is told through the Mishomis book. Eddie Benton, who's the Grand Chief of the lodge that I attend, he actually has this written in his book on how we as a people have taken anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 years to actually do this migration route. And as we traveled along the St. Lawrence River, we actually had many stops along the way where we had people that hunted, we had people that fished, or whatever trade that they had, because, you know, not too many people talk about how our people actually were fur trappers too. And so we would actually stop along the way, and some people would stay and some people would still continue. So with this story, it was a prophecy that was told by a prophet that would tell us to go where the food grows on the water. So there was so many different stops that we actually came to where we are today. And actually I'm in Bad River, Wisconsin, in Odana, where it actually kind of ended there. So I will speak about it a little bit more. So we actually have this symbolic petition carried to Washington, D.C. in 1849, which reflects the cultural importance of Manoomin. So this here, the lines were really indicating to Washington politician that the various clans, so the animals here represent those clans, where the one mind and the one heart, as you can see the lines drawn from each heart, and then to all the resources of the more than human beings. There's a connection to the Manoomin as the lakes as well. So they say that the river here, number 9, is actually like the Bad River, and these other lakes are actually part of the sloughs that are here on the Bad River Indian Reservation today. So the privilege of hunting and fishing and gathering the wild rice upon the lands, the rivers, and the lakes included in the territory ceded is guaranteed to the Indians during the pleasure of the President of the United States. So this is actually from a treaty with the Chippewa from the 1837 treaty. So can you imagine how we were told as a people that we do have this privilege? So some Anishinaabe elders relate to the older term for the wild rice beds as Manadu Gitagan, and it's considered the Great Spirit's garden. It is a responsibility that they can be cared for the rice beds like gardens, and also the abundance that exists within them. The best example of that comes from more than survival. The sustenance tradition sustains meaning for the Ojibwe people, which is Manoomin harvesting, fishing, which is spear fishing, and gill netting. You know, we have the oga, the walleye, the sturgeon. The whitefish is really predominant in Keweenaw Bay Indian Community. And so like people from Red Cliff can actually come over to KBIC waters and be able to sustain their way of life. We have sugar bushing, which is going on right now, so it kind of slowed down. So we have a lot of people in our communities that are so excited about, you know, getting the maple syrup, because that's our first medicine, that first mashkiki, and that's what's the first medicine that wakes up. So we also have berry gathering, hunting. So we just had an elk hunt this last fall. So each tribe were given the opportunity to take an elk tag and actually go acquire an elk, and they were able to bring it back. And so GLIFWC actually harvested it or processed it, and then it's going to get divided amongst the tribes in order to be able to, for them to have the meat for ceremonies. So there's also fur trapping. So the arrival of Europeans in the fur trade. So that really was the turning point for how the fur trade actually became very important when they started writing down our history. As you can see, there's a lot of journals that we've come across, and GLIFWC has a few that we were able to kind of look at. We've also have surveyor notes over in KB to where we can see, you know, some of the history, especially with the LVD trail between Keweenaw Bay and Waters Meet. And then this here is the Upper Lake St. Croix. You can see where they document wild rice waters. So there's a lot of, you know, good historic rice beds. And also mentioned in those explorers journals was under a wide variety of names. So it's also known as wild rice, fool's oats, marsh oats, Manoomin, which is in our language. So you can see that it had many different names. And also a fawn skin was a common trade quantity, which surprisingly was reported to hold about 2 bushels. So they talk about how we, you know, raise plenty of Irish potatoes, catch pike, suckers, pickerel, and whitefish in abundance. And they also have, you know, beaver, deer, and moose. And moose is, you know, we're starting to see it throughout Keweenaw Bay. We also had it at the Natural Resources Department. I didn't get to see the moose yet, but, you know, they're still around. But they, the provision they chiefly depend on is wild oats, of which they purchase great quantities from the natives. So wild rice was, you know, a big thing back in the day, and that's how it was able to sustain our people and the fur traders as well. So we have, you know, a comparison of wild rice and white rice here on the nutritious value of it. So it's high in protein, high in fiber, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, and zinc. And we also have a long history of harvest. What I really loved about these pictures, it just showed, you know, how beautiful it was to be able to go out, you know, as a Anishinaabe people and to, you know, acquire that precious gift that we get from Gitchimanadu. And so this picture here shows the Sikwe actually taking her ricing sticks and bending it over the canoe, and you just slightly tap it. So you want to be very gentle because, as I say, Manoomin actually ripens at different stages. So anybody that kind of comes through here will be able to go back through again and be able to get it again. But sometimes if we have a rain, sometimes the rice chiefs will shut down that rice bed for a few days, and to be able to let that Manoomin drop in. And so we could have that reciprocal relationship and that honorable harvest to let some return back to the waters. And this slide here is important because, you know, we must harvest in a good way because of the gradual ripening of the plant. So as you can see here, this is a really good methodical way of being able to harvest. As you can see the fine lines here, they actually, you know, were able to canoe and then be able to turn and go back again. So that's a good way of being able to, you know, harvest Manoomin to where somebody could come back, because it will actually stand back up, and then because you don't want to beat it back down because some of it, the broken rice will still continue to ripen, but you want it to be able to stand back so the next harvester will be able to go back through and continue. And this is the good part. This is a lot of hard work because as Anishinaabe people, we were always taught that we had to work very hard, you know, for our way of being able to sustain our way of life. So drying green rice. So we actually, today we lay them out and then we actually try to get as much moisture out as we can through the drying process. It could take anywhere from a couple of days to about a week. So parching the green rice, so we have these big kettles. We have kazel pans right now that are stainless steel, and we put them slowly over a nice heated coal. You don't want to do it too heavy of a heat because otherwise it will start popping on you, especially if it still has that moisture in it. So you want to do it nice and slow to be able to parch the green rice because you want to be able to get those awnings with the husks off. So jigging the rice. So Roger's very good at this. So if you get to come to a Manoomin camp, he'll teach you how to do the twist. And he does it really well. So I actually have video of him, which I wasn't able to put on here. But, you know, jigging the rice is where you kind of get the chaff to kind of separate from the kernel. So you keep going until you can kind of check, and then you'll kind of judge it. So you have cross poles here, which will be able to kind of hold your weight up a little bit, because if you put all your weight on it, you'll actually break the rice. So sometimes we get the littles to go in there, the kids to go in there and dance the rice for us. Winnowing the rice. So we actually have these birch bark baskets. So birch is getting ready, the wigwas is getting ready to be harvested soon, and then we'll be able to make these baskets to be able to winnow the rice. So you kind of toss it gently in the air to kind of separate the chaff. And here's your finished Manoomin. So as you can see, it's got, you know, the broken rice in there. It's all different stages, but this is, man, the best medicine that you can get. So the wild rice beds that today, actually, this is how they look. So we actually, here at GLIFWC, we do aerial surveys. So that begins probably towards the end of August, or the end of July, beginning of August. So we actually have some rice beds in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and sometimes if the tribes want us to, we actually go do LVD and a couple lakes over there at KB. And this is the way that they harvest. So this picture here with the gentleman in the bandana, I actually worked for him back in the late 80s. And the guy standing up is actually my supervisor when I worked for the Wisconsin Conservation Corps. I was actually there when this picture was taken. So they actually took us down to actually harvest rice. So we have a push puller in the back, which gently pushes you along. And then you have the gentleman sitting here with the rice knockers. And so there's an example of the cedar sticks and the push pull. And then sometimes, you know, people have different methods. And then we spread the rice out on the tarp, and then you kind of see where it starts getting a little bit dry there. So Wisconsin harvest regulations, since, you know, I do a lot of work for Wisconsin. So the overview is we have, we require a permit for on reservation or off reservation actually, but we also do it for tribal and non-tribal people. So we actually have a permitting process where you can go through, I believe it's the state of Wisconsin DNR. You go onto their website and then you can get your permit. So you have to be a Wisconsin resident for that. So you actually have smooth rounded wooden knockers, and I believe they're 38 inches long. Non-motorized boats. We have push poles or paddles because we don't want to actually, you know, do any kind of harm to the plant. So we actually have restricted hours where you have to go out about 10 a.m. to sunset. And some of the waters here in Wisconsin are date regulated. So if you have family members that are here in Wisconsin, they could actually go onto the GLIFWC site and they can see when those lakes are actually open. So that's part of our aerial harvest that we will be doing to be able to, you know, help the rice chiefs be able to determine which beds are worth going to harvest. So it cuts down a lot of time. So Michigan harvest regulations, currently there is none. So what Roger teaches at Rice Camp, we try to follow the 36-inch, you know, in the cedar knockers, and they have about 8 inches each for the 2 knockers. So it's about a pound. We have non-motorized canoes, no larger than 17 feet. And we try to practice that honorable harvest. Also, what you could do is, if you haven't done it before, is find someone who has harvested, and they will kind of show you the ropes. Or you can attend a wild rice camp. Wild rice camp at KB is open for everyone, to where, you know, we will teach you how to actually harvest the rice, how to do all aspects that we have just shown you, and most of all, how to typically get going, what kind of canoe to use and all that. So this here is, you know, the modern way of being able to harvest our rice. So Roger calls this the Manoominator. So it's actually a thrasher that is made, and it has these little paddles that you can kind of adjust. So it kind of turns the rice as it goes along. And I believe this looks like a parcher here in the middle. And then this is another way that you can use a fan to be able to get the chaff off after you thrash it. So typical finishing rates is 100 pounds of green rice. You'll get between 40 to 45 pounds of finished rice. A typical ricer who harvests about 100 pounds of green rice, and if you take it to a professional, we do have it on our GLIFWC website for who can do it professionally here in Wisconsin, and I think we're going to have to kind of expand out a little bit. But you actually have to give the finisher probably about 20% in the end. So you'll actually have about 35 pounds of rice, you know, for your pantry. And we also try to store it in glass. Roger always teaches us to do it in glass because you want to be able to seal it, and that way it won't get that much moisture back in, because otherwise it will spoil it. So why not just go purchase rice? So 3 pounds for $17.99. So this is actually cultivated rice on the left. So it's much darker, it's a lot harder. It takes a lot of time to actually cook it. I actually have some in my pantry, but you put it in a jar and use it as a bookend for my cookbooks, because it just takes a few hours to really cook that Manoomin. And it doesn't taste as well either, where the stuff on the right is the traditionally hand-parched rice, where it has a much nuttier flavor. And it's just so much better to cook, and it takes a lot less time depending on how the rice is actually processed. So some of the rice, especially the stuff I buy here in Bad River, it takes probably about 20-25 minutes to actually get your rice going for to make soup or casseroles. So our stewardship of Manoomin. So Manadu Gitdagon, the Great Spirit's Garden. So look at that beautiful rice head and the beautiful lake behind there. So I've always loved this term, you know, for the rice beds as the Great Spirit's Garden, because it captures the idea so well that while this is in essence a wild plant, and its abundance of productivity can be enhanced much like a garden with proper stewardship. And in with that regard, it also captures a sense of responsibility that the Ojibwe feel to care for the special gift from the Creator. Threats and opportunities. So what I'm going to talk about here in Wisconsin, especially, you know, because same way with the Michigan, we have a lot of man-made dams. And unfortunately, you know, with LVD, they also have one down there, which, you know, we talk about kind of trying to
Oh,
lower the water level a
Kathleen?
little bit. Yes,
Kathleen, just a second. People may not know what LBD is.
Lac Ville des Airs.
Oh, LVD, there we go. Mm-hmm,
Lac Ville des Airs in Waters Meet.
mm-hmm. The Indian community there.
Yeah, so that's actually in Michigan. So that's why I like to kind of focus a little bit on that. So much has been lost. So for example, this is Rice Lake in Polk County, and this is the Chippewa flowage in Sawyer County. So you can see how detrimental it is, you know, at one point where the dam kind of took everything out and they built this. So they were able, sometimes it, you know, it can do some good and sometimes it doesn't do so well. So as we go back to those journals, we see that the wild rice here, but you can see what it looks like today. And so you can see where, you know, in relation to where it says wild rice. So it's actually a disruption of the natural hydrology. So remember that. So invasive species, for example, they are, yeah, cattail, they actually have a hybrid kind now. And it's starting to take over those Manoomin beds. So this image here shows the loss of rice beds to expanding clones of the narrow leaf cattail. So the broadleaf is what is, you know, natural to our space here, but they actually do hybridize. So you can see in 2006 how the cattail is, you know, a lot smaller in 2016 and how it expanded. Also, we have residential swans and geese now. So they're beautiful, aren't they? And they're a natural part of the ecosystem. So really how big is the issue can be. Geese and swans are really fond of wild rice. So 30 years ago, it wasn't really a problem because essentially the only geese and swans we had in the region were the ones that were migratory. So these birds bred in the far north, probably Hudson Bay, or in Alaska for swans, and only showed up here as Manoomin was completing or had completed its life cycle. So this picture here is of geese on a young bed of green rice that couldn't have been taken 30 years ago. But a lot has been changed in over 30 years. Looking at the swans first. So this here is, you know, what we kind of try to do is we do a lot of research with, I think Minnesota, University of Minnesota and Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we actually have, you know, been able to kind of keep track of these breeding populations of the trumpeter swan and the goose population, and it keeps going up and up. And so it's very detrimental to the rice beds. So as you can see here, you know, the local breeding swans and the geese feed on all the Manoomin. So it actually breaks it off. So Manoomin seems to be the preferred food source, and both species actually feed heavily on the leaves, the shoots, and the male flowers. And we've seen some places that, you know, actually look weed whipped, just like this picture here. And as you can see, this is a close-up of what it actually looks like. So I've been in some rice beds over in Parrot Lake and Vermilak Lake, which is, you know, the Manoomin stewardship for KBIC, where it actually had been broken off quite well here. So climate change. You can see that the total rainfall. So now we're going to speak a little bit about the rainfall. As you notice, we've been having a lot of increase in the rainfall. So the most damaging flood in Duluth's history, 4 years and 3 weeks later, you can see the big difference. And that's just a short time frame. And this is a picture, as you remember, the flood of 2012, Father's Day flood. And you can see that the news chopper, this is actually Target up in Duluth. And you can see how how much those, and I think this is Savers thrift store that I usually go to, and now this is a Hobby Lobby. What it can really do, you know, with the precipitation, and for example, the Father's Day flood up in Houghton even. So this here depicts 3 important lakes of Minnesota rice beds. The pictures to the left are actually good years and what it looked in 2012. So that's why we showed the pictures and the flood for 2012 and how it really kind of took the rice out. So they had widespread failure that year. So we have another area which is ongoing, which is Radigan flowage. It actually kind of blew out the dam. And so remember the pictures with the lines? So you have to kind of assess the damage there and how when that culvert kind of gave out, oh my goodness, and then it just went to the low water. So remember those lines? That's where that perfect lines for the harvesting the rice were going. So there's been a determination made about the cost of rebuilding this. And sometimes it's not a high priority because given to funds, you know, sometimes GLIFWC does assist, you know, with some of these funding projects. We work a lot with Wisconsin DNR. We work a lot with the federal entities also to be able to try to rebuild some of this because otherwise they lose the rice beds like this. So, but it depends on the cost. And it points out how the infrastructure has been built, you know, to higher and more expensive standards than in the past. And also we have more high wind and hail events. So for instance, over at, I think it was Vermilak Lake I went to one year, we had those straight line winds that actually came through our communities from Keweenaw Bay Indian Reservation. And I had to call up Roger and I said, Roger, I go, oh my goodness, our rice is broke. Why is that? And so I actually went on to the Ross weather station, which is up at the Berga Plains, and noticed that just before that event, before we noticed it, there was high wind events. So the straight line winds actually picked up the waves. And I learned this from Roger and broke the rice. So we weren't able to really harvest the rice that year because we were kind of looking to be able to see if we had harvestable beds. Also with the increase of precipitation, we have a lot of brown spot disease. So with the raise of temperature, this is kind of like a fungus that actually grows on the plant and it can be very detrimental to the Manoomin. It's just really heartbreaking. So through our aerial photos, we were able to depict it here through the big lake. As you can see that on the left, you have a nice rice bed. And on the right, you can actually see it from the air where it's brown spot. So that's why we're able to post these pictures onto our GLIFWC site and actually let the wild rice chiefs know too that that lake, you know, is really impacted by brown spot disease. So this here, there was pictures, and I think my internet is really not doing well. So this was actually depicted 11 years on Dean Lake. So we had a few good pictures and then we had a few poor pictures. And as you can see, they're starting to pop through. So I don't know why that is being that way. So you could see that, you know, 2011 was a failure, 2012. And then we have 2013 and 2014, which really has flipped kind of negative. It's just like a negative to where on the outskirts you have good rice in the middle. The next year, 2014, it kind of reciprocated that. So in 2015, you had good year. 2016 looked like it had brown spot disease, kind of like 2010. So 2017 was another good year. 2018, not so good. 2019, it was excellent on Dean Lake. So out of that, for 11 years, this is what I was talking about, how climate change is, you know, changing from that 4-year rule that we learned from our elders, and it's actually kind of extending out a little bit more. So 2010, 2011, 2012, 2016, and 2018 were not so good years. So our stewardship for Manoomin. So we have a lot of wild rice restoration. We actually replace a lot of culverts. We also do aerial surveys. and ground truth. So we actually do on the ground surveys, which we'll be able to do this year. So last year we weren't able to have any kind of interns to help us do the ground truthing. So this year is the first year since the pandemic that we're actually going to have interns to be able to go out and conduct those surveys once again. So for some of the KBIC projects, you familiar with Bear Lake up there in Hope, you know, just north of Hancock. So this picture to the left, we actually drug a canoe and we put a couple 100 pounds of rice up there, but unfortunately the following year it didn't take. So we have some hit and miss years. So it's kind of interesting to see, you know, how some of our projects with KB and the state, we still have that reciprocal relationship on our, you know, stewardship for Manoomin, because DNR love it for their duck hunters and their wildlife. And so the middle picture here is actually Net River. So we did a lot of restoration with Wild Rice Camp. We were actually able to bring a lot of participants out. And since we didn't have harvestable rice, we were able to take them out and participate in a restoration project. So the picture to the right is Vermilak Lake, which is nearby. And this is what I was talking about. The straight line winds actually came in and broke that rice. So I was able to take a picture of this. And I still had them on my phone. So it was great to be able to still have some of the projects that I was a part of when I worked for the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community Natural Resources Department. So the restoration of hydrology. So this is a perfect example of how when a culvert's replaced and how the rice actually comes back. So this is an example of it. So we have the pre-culvert correction on the top page, and down on the bottom, the first year is the right after that. So you have some rice coming back. So you could actually see that the rice, you know, really did well. So this is the part of the aerial surveys that GLIFWC does. And so we were able to document a lot of this. So seeding for restoration, you can see how the seeding is done here. You can actually see the lines there. It almost looks like, you know. So you can actually see where the, you know, behind the boat where it just dropped the rice in, and how great it is to kind of see depicted in this picture. So for phantom flowage, it's also the same thing. You can see the rice kind of coming up. So ricing actually, when you're doing seeding, it actually happens in the fall time. So this shallow flowage here is actually built for wildlife, and it tends to have the right habitat. So when everything is in alignment, I call it, you get the proper water level, the muck, you know, the water clarity has a lot to do with the inlet and the outlet, the gentle flow of water. And so you can see this is the next year of phantom flowage, and how, you know, our good stewardship, if we keep these skills going, what great way of being able to showcase that. So with LVD, Lac View Désert, as you can see, some of the aerial photos that were taken here at GLIFWC in 2003, so these were way before my time, on how when they did their restoration project in 2010, how great that rice bed is. So we were talking a little bit about it, you know, before we came on for this presentation. So you can see how our stewardship and our reciprocal relationships on how we kind of work with our tribes. So we also do beaver control on selected waters, where sometimes it can impede, you know, the wild rice beds by changing the water levels. And some water levels actually do quite well if it has high water levels, and then if it drops way down, sometimes you can actually have drawdowns on certain dams to where it won't even harm the rice, just as long as it doesn't dry out. So some of our education outreach, we have rice camps. We also post some signage, and we have youth groups. So Roger was really detrimental to, not detrimental, but very
Instrumental.
It was instrumental. I was like trying to find the words. Very instrumental on teaching our KBIC youth. We would bring them over for a day camp, and he would teach the young ones how to make the ricing sticks, and, you know, give them those teachings on how to be good stewards for Manoomin. And here at GLIFWC, if you want any more information, we do have brochures for wild rice. So all you have to do is reach out to me. And so KBIC Manoomin Camp, which is coming soon. So you can look for that event on the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community Natural Resources Department website or Facebook page near Labor Day weekend. So you could go over there and start visiting. I actually have a link here for some of the Manoomin albums that we did do on previous camps, and I'll share it right here real quick. And then as you can see, and there's Roger there, and he's talking about, you know, the ricing sticks. So we have so many beautiful people that come together. We had a lady that actually came from Rhode Island that wanted to learn about Manoomin. And so we have so many teachers that are willing to share their knowledge. We teach you how to make ricing poles, or push poles is what we call them. It's been a while, Roger. It's been 2 years. So Roger will actually come over and he'll show you how to do that. And then you just got to figure out a way to get them home. So we had plant technicians from KB that actually made these wood shaving benches that really helped out. And so participants are able to make tools. They're able to make connections. They actually learn how to process the rice also, which I could get to here in the end. And so we actually had canoe safety too. Roger did the Manoomin part. He taught you how to push pole and how to, you know, kind of tuck and roll, I guess, before you fall in. There's so many different stories. So there's an example there. So I just wanted to show this really quick, you know, but we might not have, you know, the full aspect with the cultural aspect, you know, this year, because they might just go into processing, you know, the wild rice. So we had a cultural component here where we made moccasins, we made shakers, we did a restoration project. And so it just showed many aspects of it. So there's a construction of the jigging poles, but it's very, very beautiful on how we kind of come together as a community. So I kind of jumped to the end here, and it shows, you know, Roger winnowing the rice. So it's a beautiful way of being able to come together as a community and to learn our stewardship, you know, for Manoomin, and to teach everybody who wants to learn about it, especially in the state of Michigan. So you can access that on the Michigan Sea Grant, and you go to their media tab, and then you can click on the pictures. So Todd Marcy was responsible for being able to take all those beautiful pictures. So we want to get back to, you know, how ricing actually looks. And this is just a beautiful way of, you know, having this relationship with our rice out there on the landscape. And you can almost see it looks like almost a morning dew out there. So some of the Manoomin projects here at GLIFWC, we have a lot of education and outreach, which I'm able to connect with you today. We are part of many restoration projects. So if Roger needs seed, we can see if we have, you know, extra little June, maybe we could kick over, but he will have to give me a call. So those are some of the reciprocal relationships that we have. We actually are a part of some stewardship plans. So Michigan is actually starting to do their wild rice management plan as we speak. So that's in the planning process. We also do research with many universities and other tribal entities, federal, you name it. So we also are part of wild rice camps, and we also sit on a variety of committees. So that's the end of my presentation. So do we have any questions?
Yes, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And we already have one. The Michigan Anishinaabe Caucus of the Democratic Party initiated legislation to make Manoomin our state grain, which would bring it extra protections. And she is reaching out a hand, wondering if GLIFWC would be interested in supporting this initiative and helping get it passed to make wild rice for Manoomin the state grain.
So we could sit in and have, you know, much consultation. So we can't speak, you know, for the tribes. And Roger could speak a little bit more about this. He's been an integral part of this, you know, stewardship for the rice. So you can actually send me the link, because we actually have one of my supervisors here, Miles, is actually sitting on the Anishinaabe Caucus too, I believe, and for the Mayingan, for the wolf. so we can actually be a part of it. So if you want to send me that information, you can, and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, and you can send it to me, and I'll forward it to Kathy if you don't have her email. Are there any other questions? Oh, well, I had a question. How long is the, oh, here's one. Where can we find out more information on the wild rice camp? Is it going to be posted in anywhere?
So from what I understand, Roger, we were talking, or KB was actually talking about having it with LV Blackview Desert this year. So Roger was going to approach leadership to see if they were still going to be open to having it there. So then that way, you know, you can actually go on to the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community Natural Resources Department website or their Facebook page.
Great.
You could also go on to the Native Wild Rice Coalition Facebook page, and we normally post any of our workshops that the initiative and the Native Wild Rice Coalition conduct throughout the state of Michigan. And we're actually in the process of setting up a blog. I thought it was going to be a web page, but apparently it's going to be a blog. But was going to be the Native Wild Rice, or Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. It's going to be going up pretty soon. So either of those two sources, we will be actually be posting, you know, for those dates and camps and registration and such.
Okay, so that would be the KBIC website and Facebook page, and those would probably be really good. Mhm.
Well, KBIC has one too, but
Oh, okay.
under Facebook, they have we have a page on Facebook, Native Wild Rice Coalition.
Oh, okay.
And that, like I say, in the very near future, we're going to have a blog, the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. So that'll be posted on there as well.
Okay, great. All right. Are there any intertribal collaborations with the Menominee Nation going on?
So I'm aware of a couple collaboratives going on, but because it's kind of outside our ceded territory a little bit, I've been on some research calls with, you know, a couple members from down there, but I know that they were kind of reseeding some other rice beds down there, and I think Scott Heron, he was one of our teachers, might be a little bit more aware of those projects down there. Unless if Roger, was that one of the ones that you were talking about too, where they kind of went out into Green Bay area?
Yeah, actually, in the Fox River, at one point, you know, historically, that's basically how Green Bay became its name, Green Bay, Wisconsin, where the Oneida Nation, they were relocated, but before the Oneidas took over that area, that was one of where the Menominees in central Wisconsin went to because of the abundance of Manoomin that was in Lake Michigan, actually in Green Bay. But when the colonizers came and industrial things came in, becoming a harbor and a dredging and everything else, the wild rice was wiped out. But yeah, that bay was called Green Bay because of the abundance of rice that was in that area, and it was actually part of the Menominee Nation, is where they went and did and gathered their rice on an annual basis.
Okay.
Big witch for that, Roger.
How fast does Manoomin spread? Is it possible for it to compete with narrow-leaf cattails?
So Manoomin is actually, when a seed actually drops, it actually drops right in to the muck. So it doesn't spread out, you know, too far out. It will actually compete with narrow leaf cattails. So I've been on, a few researches actually trying to learn about narrow leaf cattail, because there's also a hybrid too, which that species will actually outcompete, the habitat for wild rice. So there's a lot of aquatic plant management permits that we actually filter through, and then that's because wild rice is actually really considered where I want to say a precious plant to the state of Wisconsin, to where we actually have to kind of go through some of these permits and see if they're using any kind of chemicals. We try not to use chemicals at all, and we prefer mechanical. So we do have comments, for a lot of aquatic species. A lot of them is Eurasian water milfoil, a curly pond leaf too is another one that we deal with. So there is some permits that are coming down to where with the Wisconsin DNR that they actually have a management plan to where they're going to go in and try to do some mowing and try to do some restoration projects that we're a part of.
And wild rice has usually end up being the loser to, cattail dominance, but the increase in the cattails also increases because of the change in habitat, and that's part of the result of climate change, mainly because of increased temperatures, decrease in flow rate. The other thing is that the cattails, their root systems are more tuberals and tubers. And so once they start getting root in there, it makes it difficult for the wild rice to actually plant and themselves when they grow in. It's the very same thing with like the yellow lily pad. Those lily pads have that same root system. And, when the water conditions change and warm up and everything else, they have a chance to dominate. And one of the other things is like with the lily pads and EWM, the Eurasian water milfoil, those type of plants that put a canopy up on the surface of the water that prevent the penetration of sunlight affects the germination and sprouting of that wild rice seed in the spring. So that's where, as Kathy was saying, is these mechanical mowers we try to come in, is because we try to because we don't want to put chemicals in it, because to treat those, we try to do either, like at LVD in Michigan, we use what they call the DASH system, which is diver assisted suction harvesting, and actually hand pulling through like snorkeling and cut some of the other things. Because if you
Oh, Roger, you're muted.
Yeah, it said the host muted us.
I'm sorry, it was an accident.
So yeah, the vegetation, that's why it's important that, when you're doing your monitoring, you also do your vegetation studies and try to get what I call a WAG, is an estimate. And I won't tell you what WAG really means, but it's an estimate. If you're in my rice camp, I would tell you, but it's an estimate of the increase or decrease of that competitive vegetation.
Okay, well, thank you. Are mute swans a problem as well for wild rice?
They are, because they browse very much like the trumpeter and the goose or the geese. They can browse large areas, and they can affect a wild rice bed, especially if it is in one of their down years in the sprouts are coming up. They browse heavily, and those are three of the things. But one of the things is we don't want to eradicate them very much like the mick or the beaver. We want to live in balance and harmony with our brothers and sisters. No, they can browse, and that's where, you know, you really, and actually when we do our restoration process, our projects, we normally start at, you know, like 50 pounds per acre in seeding to try to get the pilot and see if, you know, if that habitat will support wild rice. But if we start getting browsers and everything else, we'll increase that up to 100 pounds or 150 pounds per acre.
Wow.
If the habitat, you know, does support that, just to make sure that, you know, actually, and in addition to that, we do that to increase the seed bank, because, you know, one of the things I don't recall Kathy saying is that the Manoomin actually is an annual plant.
Oh.
So it's not, it needs to be, you know, it's dependent on a seed bank. So it's not a perennial plant. It's you know, that plant actually has a life cycle of 1 year. I don't remember if you said that in your slide or not, Kat.
No, I didn't get too far into that, but I just said it was an annual. So actually, GLIFWC actually has a Manoomin seeding guidelines that are available on our website, where it talks about these things that Roger is talking about. So even if you're interested in doing a wild rice restoration project, you know, in your area, there's these guidelines that we have out there for you to really kind of study about it first and try to find out if you have that habitat. And like what Roger's talking about too, you know, it is an annual grass, and you also have to, you know, build up that seed bank. So if you're going to do a restoration project, they recommend 3 to 5 years. Even with Keweenaw Bay Indian Community, we actually had to kind of advocate for some of our grants, because there was one grant where it only allowed us to do a short time, which was 3 years, I believe. We did ask for an extension, you know, and so they were able to get that extension to be able to continue to build up that seed bank. So even if you had a bad year, that seed bank is still viable.
We have a question. Can we buy Manoomin anywhere in Michigan?
So you can actually go to Dynamite Hill Farms. They have a Facebook page. So Jerry John Drew, he actually does harvest rice, and then he actually does sell it. So that's one outlet for being able to, you know, help tribal members. There is some people that do sell it, but it's kind of like the word of mouth. Sometimes you can go onto the GLIFWC page, and I believe it needs to be updated. You could go on there, because there's people even in the state of Wisconsin that sell. But if you go into a store or anything like that, and pretty highly likely that it's cultivated rice. Roger might have some contacts down in Mole Lake that might be interested in selling, but this year it's been this past year has been pretty horrible. So we weren't able to really get seed, you know, for our restoration projects. We were only able to get just a little bit. So with, you know, the climate change that we've been talking about, there was low water levels over in Minnesota, where the rice was beautiful, but access to it was very minimal because the water dropped. People were actually putting boards on their feet like snowshoes to be able to get to the rice, but they weren't able to. Some people got stuck where, you know, one person had to get a helicopter to get them out. So it's been, you know, plus with brown spot disease, Mole Lake, and then a lake over in Minnesota. When I was talking to some of the rice chiefs there, or the vendors for the wild rice restoration for the seed, they said that their rice kind of turned yellow, which I'm believing it might be brown spot disease.
Well, and I think this will be our last question. It's an endorsement from Veronica, who says Rice Camp is amazing. And she's asking, is there an example that's appropriate to share about how Anishinaabe culture practices benefit Manoomin?
So there might be, I'll have to look at the pamphlet that we have. So I think there's some good information on there that will, you know, be able to, I think you can go request it through the public information office, and then they will actually send you the pamphlets. Or you can Google it too. You can Google it. Or go to rice camp. You learn so many amazing things there, especially at Roger. I learn every time I'm with him, I learn. I'm really, really happy that he's here today.
How long does rice camp last?
I think they were talking about possibly just doing it through the weekend this year.
I see. Mhm. Okay. Well, Kathy, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
I'll meet
I
Gwitch, so
And Roger, I'm so glad that you were here.
Well, I was signing on to support Kathy. She is basically still a novice in her job, but she's been behind me in many rice camps, and we work in a lodge together, and so we're very good friends. And I really shouldn't even say good friends. She's more of a sister to me than a friend or a co-worker.
Well, she sure sounded like an expert to me.
I know somebody had asked me if I actually harvested rice. I was like, I did back in the day over here at Bad River, but I've been so busy doing wild rice restoration and rice camp that I didn't have that time for myself. So hopefully soon, soon.
Well, thank you all again so much. And we are recording this. So there will be a link to the recording on the Keweenaw Wild Ones website, keweenaw.wildones.org, if you would like to share it with anybody. All right. Well, I guess that concludes our presentation. Thank you all so much for coming. Bye-bye.
Mama P.
Miigwech.